Hello, everyone. Welcome on this Friday afternoon, or maybe not quite afternoon, depending on where you are in the world today. Thanks for coming to hang out with us today. We're going to do a little bit of Adobe Creative Cloud as a mobile makerspace. Todd, it's all you.
Thank you, Melissa. And thanks everyone for joining us on this Friday. Today's topic is a little bit different than some of the other webinars, and you'll see why. Um, we're thinking of Creative Cloud, which most of you probably know is more than just a collection of applications. It's actually a platform and a service and an ecosystem, if you want to think of it that way. We're conceiving of it as a mobile makerspace and what that means for transforming teaching and learning. My name is Todd Taylor. I have two titles, one of which is pedagogical evangelist for Adobe. I'm also a professor of English at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I have been for 23 years. Uh, my other webinars in this series have been very how-to sorts of projects. This morning, when I needed to help my wife prepare for her yoga class that she's going to teach in the living room, I had to figure out how to pair my headset with her computer, and I went to the internet and I figured out how to do that. 2 weeks ago, or actually last Tuesday, or this Tuesday, I led a webinar, very practical, on how to use Adobe Spark to compose student research projects and presentations. I also, the week before that, led a webinar on how to use Adobe Spark to create lesson plans and video content. Next week, next Tuesday, I'm going to be leading a webinar on how to use Adobe Acrobat Pro with video conferencing to give your students feedback on their work in progress. And so those are very familiar and sort of practical genres. Today, it's going to be a little bit more of a meta how-to, a little bit more stratospheric and conceptual, but not in an abstract sense, but in the sense that we're kind of taking a long overview of things. Another way to sort of explain what I'm going to be talking about today is basically how to conceive of Adobe Creative Cloud as a knowledge production platform. And so what you're looking at right now is the cover of a free OER online textbook, and there's a link to it, and I'll be giving you lots of links and lots of resources at the end of this slide deck. And by the way, there's a link to all of these slide decks and all these webinars that I'll show you at the end. And if you don't want to wait till the end, if you have to go, you can look to toddtaylor.myportfolio.com, which is the collection of everything I've been up to. And so this textbook and everything in that portfolio is aimed at this idea of transforming teaching and learning through engaged active pedagogies. And so to put this in a more concrete and direct way, today's webinar is about how to use Creative Cloud to drive engaged active learning across the curriculum. And so the idea in a sentence, and if this sentence makes sense to you, you might not want to keep listening. I certainly want you to. But basically, we're thinking of a way to conceptualize Adobe Creative Cloud and what it can do for education as a scalable mobile makerspace that goes with students wherever they are. And so a lot of people aren't very familiar with the entire collection of what Adobe Creative Cloud offers. Some people also aren't really kind of clear on how it might really be appropriate anywhere across the curriculum. It used to be maybe 5 years ago that these applications and this software was mostly relevant to people in the graphic arts, the visual arts, people who were professional creators. And those were sort of niche applications, but we all know that digital transformation has changed our lives, our economies, our cultures, and certainly our education systems. We are broadcasting this webinar for the first time in April of 2020, in the very middle of the COVID crisis, where all of a sudden most universities and schools that I know of have suddenly and urgently moved to teaching remotely. And so digital transformation in that space has been fairly abrupt and is something that we're all coming to terms with. And so we are thinking about adjusting, being agile or being digitally agile in finding solutions for doing things the way we used to do in brick and mortar and face-to-face educational settings digitally and remotely. And so that's in some ways what we're conceiving about today as well. And so for those of you who might not be very familiar with Creative Cloud, it is the industry standard for digital media production. I've just clicked over to my menu of Creative Cloud applications. And so this is my individual subscription to Creative Cloud. And if you don't know, 5, 10 years ago, it used to be that you would buy one application at a time. You would get a box, you would get discs, you would install, you would update, you would read heavy print manuals. Now Creative Cloud and all of its applications are together in a platform or an ecosystem that is cloud-based, that resides up in the cloud through the internet, but is also very powerful in terms of the quality of the software that's engineered to operate from your standalone station. And so it's all integrated and connected now. What you're looking at is what you might call a sort of a mobile app experience of the interface to Creative Cloud. And this interface is really only about 6 months old. And so if you look at this collection here, this is a collection sorted by desktop app, mobile app, and web. And so you're probably familiar with this icon for Photoshop, Illustrator. We know that Photoshop edits photographs and images. Illustrator is a graphic design program. We have Acrobat, which is very familiar to people working in PDF, InDesign for desktop publishing, and so on. These are the primary desktop apps. We also then can switch to web, and this is an index of all the applications that are mostly appropriate for using on the web. In fact, the presentation you were looking at a minute ago, and I'm going to return to throughout the day, was created in Adobe Spark in the cloud on the web. There's also increasing numbers of mobile versions of the applications, some of which, such as Premiere Rush, are identical to the desktop app. And so you can access them in both places. If you look over here at the left of the interface, these applications are also sorted according to sort of modality. So photography, design and layout, video and motion, UX, UI, 3D, social media. And then within every one of these versions of these applications, you have all kinds of resources, including especially tutorials that help explain how to use these applications. And so the experience today with Creative Cloud is this kind of ecosystem of not just a suite of applications, but a collection of applications and technologies that are much more than the sum of the parts. What you have also are assets and libraries and gigabytes of storage, in fact, in some cases now terabytes of storage, to be able to work within this clouded environment to get your work done. And so that's what Creative Cloud is. It used to be something that professional creatives would couldn't live without and would do all their work with. And most people were sort of experts on one application or one modality. What's happened now in digital transformation is more people are creating ideas and sharing ideas digitally, and so there are more creators than just professional specialists. The question that Melissa asked is, what is a makerspace? And so if you're not squarely in education or in certain pieces of education, you might not recognize that term. But once I start describing it, it should seem more familiar to you. A makerspace, typically on college and university campuses, is something that's increasingly familiar. This is a photograph from my campus, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where students are working in what looks like a workshop or a lab setting, where there's lots of equipment and there are lots of tools, and it's kind of open access for people to drop in and make things. And so this is an increasingly common sight on campuses. And we're going to talk about why and how that connects with the concept for using Adobe Creative Cloud. This is another view from a makerspace on my campus, and if you look at the sort of big words on the wall, it's learn, launch, and lead. And so most of these makerspaces have what you're seeing in the background over here to the sort of center left: digital printers, all kinds of tools, power tools, sewing machines, so people can create and make things. The idea is often that it's also supposed to be an entrepreneurial space where it begins with learning. It begins with what you might be doing in a class, but then it grows into launching businesses, launching product ideas, launching solutions to problems, and then leading in making those solutions accessible and powerful for other people. And so if you think about educational institutions, this is a significant investment. I don't know how many of you might be involved in administration on your campuses, but every square foot is in some ways um, in competition among varying interests. And so to commit square footage to makerspaces and studios of this kind, and to invest in the equipment that goes into them and the life cycling of them, is a significant cost. It is a significant investment. So we want to think about this trend. Why is it that this is increasingly common? Why is it that if I were to do a Google search of makerspace in North Carolina, I think every single one of the universities in the system would be having some version of their own approach to makerspaces? I think the easiest way to articulate the value of makerspaces is to look at what's probably going to be very familiar to most of you, which is Bloom's famous taxonomy. And so I like this version of it because it's a light bulb. It's suggesting creativity and ideas. And if you remember back in terms of this taxonomy, the idea is that the higher order thinking skills build on lower order thinking skills, and that what education should ultimately do is drive towards those higher order thinking skills. And so begins with knowledge consumption and comprehension. We might call that learning in this tripartite organization here. We begin with the learning that's classic learning. But what I've been thinking about and what I've been trying to do for my entire career of over 25 years in university teaching is to move students away from being passive, disconnected consumers of ideas and moving them toward being active, connected producers of thought. And so, to me, in my experience, and a lot of research backs this up, is when you move away from these lower level cognitive moves, and when you move beyond knowledge and comprehension to application, analysis, and eventually synthesis and evaluation, that's when even the content of a course becomes more sticky. That's when whatever the learning outcomes from the course become more transferable to other contexts. And so I would submit that this is the reason why it is a national and I guess international trend for campuses to invest in this kind of entrepreneurial space, where students are taking the knowledge they began to build in their courses, and then they're often working independently outside of the curriculum to apply, to create problem solve, to eventually lead, as the words on this wall suggest. They learn something in class, they launch a creative problem-solving approach to that to knowledge, and then eventually they're leading others with what they've discovered and what they've developed. And so that is clearly the ultimate goal of education, and that's what I'm suggesting Creative Cloud is at its best for. It's at its best when it becomes exactly that kind of makerspace, that kind of invitation or literal or virtual space for students to have that kind of experience and that kind of active, engaged learning. All the research I've seen also shows then on the key metrics of student success, from recruitment to first year success to time to degree, to successful job placement upon graduation, especially for students on the margins of academic culture, for whatever reason that might be. It is these high touch Bloom's taxonomy, active engaged pedagogies that pull those things together, that make sense of the educational experience for them and drive forward. And so to me, that's when Adobe Creative Cloud is at its best, when it is being used to drive and promote exactly that kind of experience. You're looking at a building called Lasan Studios at the University of Utah. And this is the thing in my 25 years of university of teaching that I'm more jealous of than anything I've seen, because this is the only university I know that has anything like this, and I wish we had the same or something similar to it at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. This is an entire building and actually residence hall committed to these concepts. On the ground floor is the coolest ultimate makerspace and entrepreneurial space I've ever seen on an educational campus. And then each floor are above that are residences, they're dorms, and actually they're pods, thematically organized pods, where people are trying to solve problems about the environment on one floor, about digital transformation on another floor, about gaming and entertainment on another floor. And students are actually, they propose and they live together in startup business sort of cohorts, where they have their own floor and they have their own pod, but then they go down to the makerspace on the ground floor and develop that business and cultivate those solutions. And I'm going to show you some pictures of what that looks like here. This is the opening. This is the foyer where you walk in. This is their version of Makerspace, where we see students doing what looks like conventional kind of work in the foreground. But over here, they're making, over to the right is a room full of tools, screwdrivers and hammers. And in the back, you're going to see there are, this is what they call the prototype room, where they're doing 3D printing and they're developing and engineering prototypes for things. This is the power tool room. There's a drill press and a table saw and a miter saw and all kinds of tools of that nature. You can't see it very well, but this woman here is actually on an industrial showing machine, which has actually produced one of the most famous startup businesses at the Lausanne studio. This is a residence floor where, and this is a communal space where the businesses work together, the startup businesses work together, and then around the other side of the space is where the actual dorm rooms are, right? And so it's just this amazingly creative and entrepreneurial space. This is mostly extracurricular. There are no classes that meet in this space. These students actually compete and apply to live in this very special experience at the University of Utah. Um, and as I said before, I'm insanely jealous of it. That to me is the sort of pinnacle of at least the brick and mortar face-to-face experience. And obviously that's a huge investment. How can we do our best to try to create or recreate an extremely enriching, engaging, creative educational experience for all of our students, not just the ones who are fortunate enough to be able to live in Lasan Studio. Now, Lasan Studio is open to the whole campus. It isn't like if you don't live there, you can't use it. It's designed to be a place for everyone. Um, and Here is actually a kind of a sort of a floor plan of that makerspace that we were just looking at pictures of. And this isn't exactly accurate, but makerspaces typically have organizations like this where there is, in Lasan Studio, there is an actual sewing machine. It's an industrial sewing machine, and there's a startup company that's actually gotten funded and has venture capital and started to making this amazing tent hammock that's actually started to become a professional business for some students. We talked about the 3D printing prototyping lab. Typically in these makerspaces, you see large format printing. Uh, at a studio makerspace on my campus in the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, there is a sound booth for podcasting and narration, making music, making voiceover. At the University of North Carolina, sorry, at Penn State University, they have pioneered something called a one button or one touch green screen studio for video production. Of course, back in the old days when people used to develop, film and photographs in with chemicals in a dark room, that would be something you would find in a typical makerspace. And then very important to all of this is space for collaboration. And we saw that in all the pictures we looked at so far. It's great to have all these stations with all these tools that people can physically visit and go in between and go through to be able to produce, to make, to create, to solve problems, to prototype, to iterate, but it doesn't really come together unless you've got a space for collaboration. And so this is a physical space. It's wonderful, and it's a wonderful incubator and sort of focal point for exactly these kinds of pedagogies and educational experiences. But we all know that everyone not going to have access to that. So one way to sort of think of Adobe Creative Cloud is as a mobile virtual makerspace that isn't tied to a physical place or physical building, that goes with students wherever they are, wherever they have a mobile device, wherever they have internet connection. And so I've replaced all of these different stations in this particular makerspace with applications in Adobe Creative Cloud. We have XD, which is for prototyping. We have InDesign, which is for making all kinds of print documents and posters and whatever you can think that's sort of two-dimensional. Photoshop, we all know that's a photo editor. Premiere Pro is a video editor. Audition is sound editing. Adobe Spark, I loosely associated, somewhat comically in my own mind, with the sewing machine because what you're looking at right now is a Spark page, and Spark page, like a sewing machine, makes it so easy to stitch things together and to bring things together that I like putting it in the center of this particular makerspace. But the true center, of course, is the collaboration space. Every single makerspace has that, and that is an essential feature of Creative Cloud. The Creative Cloud icon and logo is a kind of infinity looking symbol that is certainly meant to suggest connection among many things. And so collaboration and connection are essential elements of the way these applications are now engineered to work together to be able to not just share product and assets and things that you create on your own, but to work and iterate on the development of these pieces with your colleagues, with your fellow students, with your faculty mentors, as you're going through a problem-solving process. And so we may have these individual applications, and people may sort of, if you want to think about it, visit these individual stations, but it's when it all comes together within the ecosystem or the platform of Creative Cloud that this gets to be really powerful. Of course, I've been saying for 25 years that the classic mistake with instructional technology is to focus on the equipment and lose sight of the people themselves. So far, we've been talking about rooms and spaces and architecture and applications, but it really doesn't mean anything at all unless we're thinking about the people who are using them. Principle number one for instructional technology is you want to use technology to bring people together. You want to focus first on learning outcomes, pedagogical principles, and then you want to leverage these technologies to deliver on those things, which is why that Bloom's taxonomy perspective is really more important than the significant investments we're making in literal makerspaces themselves. Why it is we're doing it is more important than how in that aspect. Here we're looking at the portfolio of a student. Her name is Valentina Arizmendi, and I first met her her first year at UNC Chapel Hill. And this is her Adobe portfolio that comes with her subscription to Adobe Creative Cloud. And I didn't mention yet that all students at my university have access to Creative Cloud and have had access to Creative Cloud since the moment they entered our school, which was Valentina's case when she arrived in the fall of 2016. So she started building this portfolio back then, and it's become very impressive, and it's grown since then. And I want to suggest that what maker students are creating is more important than the maker spaces themselves. And so I'm going to take a quick tour of her portfolio as an example of what can be done in the mobile makerspace of Creative Cloud. I'm going to look at one project she created in a digital storytelling class. This is a digital storytelling class where students tell a story of community that they select themselves. Valentina was interested in telling the story of a historic theater in a small town in North Carolina that was about to be bulldozed, and a local entrepreneur saved it from the bulldozer and has preserved it to keep the history alive. And so this happened at the moment that she was wanting to tell her community story. And in this class, all the students begin their story by using their smartphones to take photographs of whatever their story is. And then they go into Adobe Photoshop to create a visual narrative. And so think about almost a virtual or a mental maker space where the first stop is the photo booth or the photo darkroom. And the reason I have them stop there in the case of my campus is that the students that I teach so often have been doing a lot of academic writing since they were in middle school, to the point that it kind of has become stiff and calcified to them. They have a lot of experience writing essays to please teachers. They don't have a lot of experience thinking about actual visual storytelling. Now, we know their world is rich and saturated with media, but what they don't have is thinking about intellectual ways to tell a visual narrative. And so that's why we begin in Photoshop with a visual narrative. In this class, they tell the same story through 6 or 7 different modalities. It's the exact same story retold again, first with a visual narrative, and then the second modality is as a magazine article using Adobe InDesign, which is desktop publishing software. And so here is her magazine article, and you can see what's happening. The photographs she's taken and edited in Photoshop are now becoming the visual narrative in intimate dialogue and dynamic relationship with the textual narrative or the linguistic narrative that comes together in a magazine style article. Now, we could never afford to print off uh, um, magazine articles for every student in this class of this quality. It would just be cost prohibitive. We also don't have the time to do that. But Adobe InDesign, even though it is in some ways thought to be meant mostly for print publishing, does enable us to get a sense of what that genre is like and how to make meaning in that space of the magazine article. The third piece to the class is to take the story and tell the same story again in the form of a podcast. Well, we study podcasts from NPR, This American Life, and then students interview people and they use SoundCloud to share their podcasts. And so now they have 3 modalities together. Um, they've got the magazine article, they've got the visual narrative, they've got the podcast, and then the fourth modality they use in the class is to make a documentary film. Um, this film was actually made in Adobe Premiere Pro, but these days there's a new video editor called Adobe Premiere Rush, which has pretty much all the power of Premiere Pro, but is much easier to use and works the same on mobile device as it does on a laptop. Um, the next application they put together is in something called Adobe XD, which is an application that's used to prototype mobile apps. And so this is Valentina's version of the same story about the varsity theater, composed in the space of a mobile application that, again, you can see is easy to share through the internet, even though we're not looking at it on a mobile application. The last modality is to use what we're actually looking at right now, Adobe Spark Page, to pull, excuse me, all the pieces together as a website. And so we've now seen the same story told in 6 different modalities. And what happens is, at this point, students are surprised to learn that every time they switch modalities, the story changes. They have to create or recreate a new narrative to match that particular genre or that particular modality. But maybe the most important application in this makerspace isn't the 6 that we've just looked at, but it's the one you're looking at now, which is Adobe Portfolio, which is an e-portfolio solution that, as you might expect from Adobe, is very good at pulling together media elements. This has been so important to Valentina's experience in education that she's just gone and run wild with all of these things. Half of what she's doing now is outside of her class assignment. She's making things for her friends, for projects, which is exactly what those maker spaces were designed to do. They were designed for this kind of collaboration, this kind of bringing people together to solve problems that connect things, that connect what's going on in a class with the world around them. So that so many of Valentina's projects now, such as this one, which was a proposal for new technology, had nothing to do with the course. They're just doing it on their own because they want to explore. And so if we think about what a portfolio now means, what it means to be literate. It used to be that there were only a small number of sort of modes in media that most people needed to be able to be good at to be considered, a literate professional college graduate. These days, however, to me, this is what literacy looks like: to have the cognitive agility, the intellectual depth of experience to be able to move through all of these different genres and modes and to figure out what is the right approach for a particular situation, a particular audience, and a particular way of connecting with people. And so I say to the students in this class, it's unlikely that you're ever going to become a professional media producer. This class isn't designed to make people into professional web developers. In fact, most of the students who take this class are business students who are telling me they can't get this kind of education in the business school right now. What they realize is that there isn't a business, there isn't a profession, a career, a community, an institution, or a program that has not been profoundly affected by digital transformation. And the best way to understand how these things work is to open up the hood and start to take them apart and put them back together yourself. In other words, that's exactly what these makerspaces are designed to do. They're designed to teach through making. They're designed to have a deeply impactful, not just engaging, not just transformative, but transferable experience that promotes higher order thinking so that students can take what they're learning and what they're developing it and apply it and adapt it to a large number of contexts in their future. And so if we look at Valentina's portfolio, which is, if you think about it now, in some ways her resume, it is mapped directly onto her visits through these different stations in the mobile or virtual makerspace that is Adobe Creative Cloud. You know, she prototyped a mobile app in XD. She edited a podcast in Audition. She created a website in Spark. She created a visual narrative through Photoshop. She created a magazine article in InDesign and a film through Premiere Pro. And it's her ability to travel through all of these different stations in the so-called makerspace that has given her a kind of literacy that is so potentially impactful and to put this in commercial terms, incredibly marketable in today's world. Not only is it marketable hard skills, it's marketable essential skills such as creativity, critical problem solving, collaboration, and communication that a student is developing with this kind of experience as they travel through the stations of Adobe Creative Cloud as a mobile makerspace. As a mobile makerspace, compared to a physical makerspace, Creative Cloud is much more mobile. I showed earlier how what these apps look like. These are all the mobile apps. In fact, it seems like there's more of them than there are in any other category compared to desktop or web. And so it is more mobile, obviously, than a makerspace that has limited hours that can only be accessed in certain times by certain people sometimes. It is more scalable. These makerspaces are expensive. They have to be life cycle. They have to be maintained. They have to be supported. They need attendance. They need lots of attention. They need HVAC. And in the wake of the new normal in COVID, they're not scalable. They're not accessible. No one can hardly get to these things at this particular moment when we are all sheltering in space. And so I want to be very clear on this, though. Makerspaces are still very, very important. Physical makerspaces with high-end, particularly advanced technologies that don't scale are still important to make available to people. And they're very important as incubators or as sort of focal points for this kind of pedagogy. But what Creative Cloud then does when you think about putting it in the hands of students is it takes that kind of experience that is incubated in a physical makerspace and it allows it to travel wherever a student might be trying to do intellectual, academic, and thoughtful critical work. And so it's more scalable. It's also more accessible when you think about increasing numbers of our students who are non-traditional, who are not working conventional residential college student hours. Full-time jobs, families increasingly need to access educational institutions online and in courses online. How can they benefit from the university's investment in physical makerspaces in a way that takes those experiences and translates them to maybe miles away or hours away when someone cannot actually walk into a space like this and have that advantage. And so the idea, obviously, that, excuse me, I've been, sort of conceptually outlining, framing in this almost essay of sorts, is this concept of, how best to use Creative Cloud and how does it connect with the context of spring 2020 and how can we use these increasing relevant and powerful technologies to help our students do more than just process content and course content and create some kind of experience that is more than just delivering content to them. One of the great concerns that I'm sure many of you are having in the wake of the new normal is that for decades, pedagogical evangelists such as yourself, I'm sure, have been working hard to transform teaching and learning, to promote exactly these kinds of engaged, active learning, and in my case, community-based work. Now, all of a sudden, in the case of emergency remote teaching, which by the way is very different than online teaching. Online teaching means you had a lot of time to plan for that and arrange for that. But what if the new normal is that suddenly more and more of us have to teach online? I'm concerned that all of that progress that's been made to try to transform teaching and learning may get pushed to the back burner in as we just struggle to survive. And so what I'm trying to frame here is a concept for how this might look in terms of trying to transfer or scale those kinds of active, engaged pedagogies, not just physically face to face when there's a studio or lab available, but at a distance, asynchronously as well as synchronously for class meetings, that goes wherever our students have a smartphone and a device. And so the idea is we all know that in this emergency moment, there are some students whose only access to their educational institutions is going to be through a smartphone. We're also aware that there are some students who don't even have that. And so one of the cardinal rules of any educational decision we make, and especially ones involving instructional technology, is again, we want to use that technology to bring people together and not separate them. And so we always have to consider issues of accessibility, and that's not just in terms of compliance for people with different abilities, physical often. We're also talking about cognitive differences, ideological differences, socioeconomic differences, all kinds of differences. These technologies in our institutions are also highly gendered. And so it is not the situation that you simply provide software to people and then everything's going to be okay. We always have to reflect critically on this, which is why I think it's important to kind of put a conceptual frame around Creative Cloud and think about what it is and how it can be best used to make a big difference in our students' lives. Now, I don't want to pretend this is easy. It is easier now than ever before, and there are lots of resources to help you get to a destination like this. And so I'm just going to point you to a couple of them. First here is a link to the Adobe Creative Cloud accessibility website where there are constant updates and information about the accessibility affordances and limitations of Creative Cloud. We have some products that are amazing, enabling accessibility. Adobe Acrobat Pro has a new liquid mode that makes PDFs more accessible to more people than ever before. Obviously, audio technologies enable some people to access some things that they couldn't before, and visual technologies help other people access things that they couldn't before. But they all have to be used thoughtfully and with understanding. In terms of resources for trying to create the kind of conceptual makerspace that I just talked about, I mentioned earlier the textbook that I wrote called Adobe Creative Cloud Across the Curriculum, a guide for students and teachers. And there are links to that there. And then again, this is a link to all of my work in my portfolio at that URL, which is toddtaylor.myportfolio.com. And as I understand it, this webinar will be followed up with some email with links to this recording and to other pieces of information and resources there. And so that is my overview and concept of thinking about Adobe Creative Cloud as a scalable mobile makerspace that goes with students wherever they are. And I see there are some questions in the chat pod. Melissa, have you had a chance to read some of that work?
Yeah,
Some of those questions?
it's been pretty general, like where a question about the Creative Cloud desktop app, and there is a mobile makerspace or a makerspace in, what was it? University of Tampa, Gina says she saw one there. And she said that looked really cool. So yeah, it's nice to know that these are out there. Judith says, very nice presentation. So yay. Does anyone else have any questions?
I've had the great privilege of traveling to many campuses, and I have yet to find a university that doesn't have a makerspace. So I'm just typing in Google right now. I think you can see my screen again. Makerspaces in North Carolina, and see what comes up. So these are just the ones near my home. Any other quick thoughts or questions before we start our weekend? Actually, my weekend doesn't start for 2 more hours, but before we end this webinar.
Yeah. Judith is actually asking if you have any specific ideas for green screen projects.
I do. I have lots of ideas. I didn't mention, and I usually do, that I often direct a first-year writing program at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And so I think a lot about the transition from high school into college, and I think a lot about the general education curriculum, and about the primary genres and modes that students experience and are assigned in our educational institutions. The most prominent is some version of a paper, and it's interesting how paper doesn't make a whole lot of sense anymore, especially if no one is physically in the same place with each other. But the second most popular academic genre, and we've done studies on this, is the presentation. And so green screen is in some ways the ideal companion for presentations, where you have a talking head typically looking into a camera with a green screen over their shoulder, and they can completely film their verbal narrative, right? And then they can use that green screen as a visual narrative to complement what they're saying. And what they're doing there is exactly what we do when we make a film. We have a visual narrative going in conversation with the textual or linguistic narrative, the audio narrative. It's what happens in that magazine article that we showed from Valentina, where we have a photographic visual narrative that's in dynamic relationship with the textual narrative. And so the most common use I've seen of green screen is just that: a student presenting a verbal narrative, and then later going in and compositing or dropping into that green screen space behind her a visual narrative. And so what that enables us to do as educators is talk about the dominant modalities for how we exchange and develop ideas today. I mean, YouTube video is probably the most common way that people are, if not the most common, one of the most common ways people are sharing ideas in their real lives. I mean, obviously in academic settings, printed text or some version of text, alphabetic text, is where most of the reading or consumption happens. But so much of our lives now is happening audiovisually. We want to teach that. We want to explain that. And you think about the nature of a green screen situation, it's meant to create a composite between a foreground and a background, between someone giving some kind of typically verbal narrative and some kind of visual narrative. And those lessons sort of transcend all of these modalities and begin helping our students learn how these things work by creating, by making, by putting their hands on it themselves, as opposed to just only doing what I did my whole life when I grew up, which I would just watch Walter Cronkite, and I would just watch a newscast, and I would think I'll never be able to access the magical technologies that are used to put that together. And now everyone can do it. It was Penn State University, which actually pioneered the one-button green screen studio. And so if you Google that, you'll find that actually a lot of campuses have now created or recreated that. In fact, Clemson University has an Adobe Creative Cloud Studio in the middle of their library that has a one-button green screen studio. You walk in, you put a thumb drive, the lights come on, the camera starts, you narrate your talk, you grab your thumb drive, you go sit down wherever you want to, and you start pulling all the pieces together. And so that's my many thoughts on green screen. Um, Now that's just the most common way of doing it. And what's so exciting to me is just how incredibly imaginative and resourceful faculty and students are when they have technologies like this available to them. That's what makes those makerspaces both literal and mobile so incredibly exciting. Is that it's just so thrilling to see what people come up with when given such powerful tools. Any other thoughts or questions out there?
Lots of thank yous.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening. Uh, I hope we run into each other at some point, not just virtually, but literally. Again, my name is Todd Taylor, and this has been Adobe Creative Cloud as a mobile makerspace. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Todd, you're awesome. Thank you for being here with us today. And we'll see everyone really soon. So have a wonderful rest of your day and then have a great weekend. Bye, guys.
Hi everyone, thanks for watching. Click the link in the description below to explore more free online professional development and click the link on screen to subscribe to the channel for more videos.